one time a year. But
Yeah.
okay, how to plan a small orchard. So, say you just bought a piece of property. Maybe it's got a home on it already, and maybe it's a half acre, maybe it's 3 or 4 acres. You know, people are wanting to know, how do I go about starting to think about planning an orchard and getting some sustainability and some food production in a perennial sense, of course, in this manner,
Yeah.
not just a garden, but
Right.
getting those fruit and nut trees on there. We want to kind of help people guide people through that thought process. What are your initial thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. The first thing to consider is your climate, microclimate, where you live.
Right.
What can you grow? What grows nearby? You know, that's something that if you're new to gardening, you can talk to neighbors. That's always a good idea. People who are already growing stuff in your area. You know, talk to nursery centers in the area, and you'll get a good sense of what can grow for you. The next thing is to think about how much space you've got to plant.
Right.
And then once you've got those things kind of defined, you can just, you know, you can pick, start picking the cultivars, the types of fruit and that you want to put in. You know, I think that it's important to think about, you know, timing wise, if you can get in some small fruit, you know, right away. You know, you get in strawberries, you get a crop. If you put in some day bearing or ever bearing strawberries by April, mid-April here in North Idaho in Zone 5B, you're going to get strawberries from midsummer on the first year. So you can get fruit the first year with strawberries. You know, you want to plant your cane fruits right away. You're going to get cane fruit in 2 or 3 years. You're going to get
your blackberries, your raspberries.
Mm-hmm. You want to put
currants.
your grapes, currants and gooseberries. I love currants and gooseberries. And you know, gooseberries are a fruit that you know, are everybody in the old days, you talk about them being sour and edible, you cook with them and whatnot, but there's definitely just wonderful, sweet, fresh eating gooseberries. That's another small bush.
We inherited some here that just came with the property that are great.
I love them. And they're early and they're prolific, and in your food forest, multi-dimensional planting, they're a small shrub. You can stick them in lots of places. But small fruit you get that small fruit in, you're going to start getting fruit the first year with strawberries. And then 2 and 3 years, you're going to start getting fruit with your cane fruits and whatnot.
So you're talking about a lot of strategy here, and we're going to have to back up and unwind that a little bit, because you're talking about a full-on perennially diverse program in that food forest idea, which is excellent. Those are some things I hadn't even thought of going into this, but let's back up a little bit and walk people through it. So thinking about, the first thing you got to understand is your climate, where you live. And so one of the things you want to know is your zone, right?
Right.
You want to know what zone you're in, you know, whether you're really a cold zone, your USDA Heartiness Zone. You can Google that. You can look that up if you're not familiar with it. And that affects both your annual gardening, but also your perennial gardening, what kind of trees you can plant. Obviously, in North Idaho here, we're not growing any citrus. Right. We're not growing any bananas or mangoes, right? We're growing apples, pears, cherries,
plums.
Most of the stone fruits, I think.
Yeah.
Can we grow all the stone fruits?
Yeah, and depending on microclimate, peaches and
even some peaches. And so you got to know your hardiness zone. You also need to know your soil type, really, and your annual moisture and how you're going to handle water, right? Because you can have a whole list of trees that work within a certain zone, but one may need more water than another. And so you've got to figure a few of those things out, don't you?
Absolutely. A good anecdote, you know, maybe to throw in is I was chatting with a friend of mine in Vermont a few years ago, and he asked me how, you know, do you have to water your apple trees after you plant them? Mm-hmm. And I said, yeah, I do. You know, here in North Idaho, arid summers, you know, water comes in the spring and fall, and it's like, yeah, if I don't water my trees for 2 or 3 years to get them established, they don't make it. Whereas in Vermont, he plants a tree, plants it, waters it, walks away, never waters it again. Water table's real low. They get constant, you know, rain. So that definitely is important. Water is life, and water is life with plants, and they have to have it. And fruit trees do take a considerable amount of water.
Right. So there you kind of move from understanding what your climate zone is, and that research is going to help you start to narrow down what kinds of trees you can grow as far as trees go. Mm-hmm. And not going too far into the other perennials yet, but that's going to start to give you a list to work from, right?
That's right.
And planning from. Thinking about water is real key. I know one strategy here in North Idaho, depending on our property, you could use is if you have water. Like we've got water on our property, so we're thinking about planting maples. You and I have talked about this up by the pond.
Yeah.
Right? Because they need water. They're not going to do well probably in some other areas unless I water them.
Right.
I don't want to have to do that personally, especially far out on the property. I don't mind around in our zone 1 here getting some water to things. But if you've got water, you can also take a tree that maybe needs more water than you get annually and look at the location of it.
Absolutely.
That's another strategy.
Microclimate is king. Yeah.
So I was going to say that's where we start going next is looking at your property and understanding microclimates.
Yeah.
And, where is it hotter? Where is it cooler on your property? Where is it wetter? Where is it drier?
Where's water coming sub-irrigating, a lot of times coming off hills, coming off mountains, That's right.
And even everybody's got roof. Everybody's got a house and a roof.
That's
so, what can you do there if you've got a certain tree that you want on your property? And we're not going to go too much, just to do a little kind of in the parentheses here into specific species and varieties, because we're talking to a whole lot of people in different places.
Yeah.
So we'll reference our environment a little bit, but these are the kinds of things you're going to think about within your environment. But you're going, okay, I want this kind of tree. I don't get a lot of water, but hey, what if you do get rain? And even in the summer, you get some thunderstorms coming through. Well, if you can direct that rainwater from your roof over to an area of those trees, that's another way to water them.
It's true. It's funny when you get into this topic because it's microclimate, like I said, is king, and there's places in the country where they're putting drain tile in to take water off. There's too much water. And then in areas like ours that we find ourselves, it's a totally different strategy.
Right.
Where in permaculture, methodologies, there's ways to address both issues in how you plant and manage your crops. But for us in the dry area, we're going to want to take advantage. We're going to make deep bowls to plant our trees in, mulch really heavily, and preserve all the water we possibly can. So we're looking to sink down deep. So that really up here water is an issue, and in some places water is an issue because there's too much of it.
Right.
But there's ways to deal with both.
So you're thinking about your zone, you're thinking about your climate, your own specific property. You kind of got a list of trees that you can grow, right? And you're starting to pick out. How do you? What do you think? Like, you just go get a whole bunch of apple trees if you can grow apple trees, even if you're on a small lot, or you get one of a whole bunch. You have any thoughts?
I do, totally.
On diversity versus just a couple things, especially in smaller spaces. How do we start thinking about that?
Yeah. So depending on your space, we're going to start talking about rootstock is something that we're going to look at. Rootstock, there's dwarfing rootstock, semi-dwarfing rootstock, standard rootstock. So these are ways to naturally keep the size down.
Controlling the size of the tree.
Depending on where you how much space you have.
So let's give them an example of we'll just talk apples because that's something that we're talking about today. A dwarf apple tree versus a, full rootstock, or what's the right word?
A standard.
Standard rootstock. How do we need to plan differently thinking about that?
So there's some key differences when you're talking about planting dwarfs. That's a tree that's got a runty root, and you are gonna take care of that thing. You're gonna stake it. You're going to make sure it has water. You're going to feed it. It needs lots of care from us because of that small root system.
But it's going to fit in a smaller space,
it's going to fit
right?
in a smaller
so somebody
space.
That's really space challenged on a small property, that's probably going to be a good way to go.
It is a good way to go potentially. The other thing to think about is, with the standard tree, we can keep it to whatever size we want as well. It just takes a little bit of work.
Just through management, pruning.
That's right.
Okay.
But it'll be a little tougher to keep it smaller, though realistically.
Okay.
But definitely possible.
Okay.
And when I'm finding 120-year-old trees that are loaded in fruit, they're not dwarf trees. People didn't plant dwarf trees. They didn't plant semi-dwarf trees.
Right.
So
that's more modern concept,
that
right?
Your grandchildren can have a swing hanging from, and that you can still be picking fruit from, and a couple generations from now, you plant a standard.
Right. So that dwarf tree is going to fit well in a small space.
That's right.
Which, if you're in that small of a space, you're probably going to be able to give it the care it's going to need. It's going to yield sooner.
That's right.
It's going to yield more quickly. But it's not going to live as long.
It's not going to live as long.
You're not going to be passing that along. So if you're developing a homestead, especially a larger homestead that you are going to be having the next generation live on, that starts to moving into that standard stock in another strategy.
And in terms of permaculture, no work. I mean, obviously there's lots of work in permaculture too, but with the standard sized roots, they have such a massive, vigorous root system that they can forage for water and food way far out there. If you connect them with mycelium in your orchard, then basically they can get water and food from an infinite distance.
Yeah.
They, so these trees that I'm finding are 100 years old and loaded with fruit, they haven't been watered or pruned or fed or anything.
They're just making
for
it on their own.
Decades.
Yeah.
And that's because of that massive root system, So in terms of planting something that you don't have to do as much work for, too, that's in a permaculture planting. The standard makes the most sense.
Yeah,
and a lot of times.
And that's where I would encourage people to think about if you can. I like the idea, and something we're going to be doing here is mixing both in, is planting some dwarfs in to get a yield a little bit sooner, because we do want to be, especially for a large family like ours, we want to be getting a yield going on the property coming back to us.
That's right.
And so we're going to do that and intermix them, and you and I have talked about this, with standard trees around them, so that eventually we can just phase those out and let those larger trees, fill in those standard sized trees. That'll come in, they'll start bearing later, but they'll start filling in. We can eventually remove the dwarf trees, and we've got kind of a succession plan to build this out.
We won't lose production, we'll just gain production. Even by the time we clip those out, we'll have large production from the standards.
Right, but you have to still think about your property and your size property, because if it was me and if I was on a small property, I want a diversity of fruit. I don't want to be stuck with just a couple apple trees. So I might start thinking, I'm going to go more dwarf or semi-dwarf so that I can get some apples, some pears, some stone fruit, get a mix in there, fit into my property, because I want a diversity of fruit, both in eating and yield over time as well. Yeah,
there's a couple strategies to just bring up really quick.
Okay.
With standards, and you can do this with semi-dwarfs and dwarfs too. But multi-graft, even if you have a tree with 3 grafts, you can put, like, say, a 1 apple tree, and you got an early apple, a mid-season apple, and a late apple, say, on the same tree. So by multi-grafting trees, we can really take advantage of space that way to increase the diversity.
That is exciting concept.
Yeah, it's super exciting.
Yeah, I've not really dove into that too much.
Yeah, and then the semi-dwarfs. If we're talking about backyard culture, a common thing these days too is to plant multiple trees in a hole. It's like you can plant 4 peaches in one hole, and you got 4 stems, and that competition keeps the peaches a little bit in check. And you keep the middle prune like it was one stem to kind of keep an open middle, right? You could have 4 different kinds of peaches growing in one hole.
Wow.
So, and you can do that with not just peaches, of course.
How does that work for the integrity of the trunk? I see a lot of trees, this property has them, and a lot of places I've been where people have either let 2 come up together or the trunk forks real low.
Yeah.
And that just always seems to be a problem.
Yes.
So how, because I'm not familiar with this concept, but I like that. I think that's great, especially for small spaces, planting. How would you manage that real quick, just growing up, so that the integrity of each tree is there, and you don't end up with breakage and it being weak?
Yeah, totally, because that's something I see all the time. That is broken. One stem will just break, and the worst, it'll be together with the other one and peel a bunch of the other tree and really damage it too. So, when they're doing this, what they're doing is they're planting the roots not together like this, but more like a 4 on a die. So it's a square with space in between each root.
All right.
Right.
So they've got a little bit.
They grow out as individual stems.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you probably got to prune them up as they're growing a little bit, so they don't start intertwining down low, I would guess.
That's right. You manage it. These things definitely need to be managed in a situation like that. But, yeah. But and just let me throw out there, that's Dave Wilson Nursery. That's a well-known California nursery.
Dave Wilson
for backyard culture. I believe that he's originated that planting
Oh,
multiples in a hole, and he's got lots of great info out there too.
Sounds like a good resource for you guys.
It's great,
Dave
yeah.
Wilson Nursery. Okay, well, those are some fun thoughts. And so another one I wanted to cover while we've got time is, so we've talked about, dwarf, semi-dwarf, full trees, thinking about, your size and location, longevity, and
Yeah.
yield. What about buying trees, buying yearlings, very small trees versus more expensive, larger trees?
Right.
And planting in orchards.
Can I back up just real quick? There's one thing that's really important. I just thought we should really talk about, and we touched on it a little, but it's spreading the season. It's super important as a backyard orchardist because you don't want just to have one tree or several trees that all come on at once necessarily and in the same time of year. So ideally for the home orchardist, we really want to start thinking about all of the fruit that we're growing. When is the earliest that we can start? What's the earliest cultivar? And then we want to look for early cultivars, mid-season cultivars, and late-season cultivars at least.
Right.
That way we're spreading the season, and we're having a consistent harvest of fruit through the whole season instead of just one big harvest.
So that people understand, because different trees are going to do well in different years.
That's true, but what I'm talking about in terms of, and pruning is something, that's another reason to prune is to keep a tree annual instead of biannual, because they definitely have a biannual tendency. They'll put a lot of energy into making fruit. The next year they take a little bit of a break. By pruning and thinning the fruit, you keep it, it doesn't use as much resource, and so it's more annual that way.
Okay, so
what we're talking about is actually cultivars like a yellow transparent, for instance, that ripens just naturally,
spreading the yield
here in Bonners in August 1st.
Right, like a transparent we have.
And then there's another cultivar that will ripen a week later, and then a week later, and there's just every day there's a cultivar that's ripening. Basically, there's thousands of apples, but you find ones at least that are just the early, mid, and late, say. Then you've got, they naturally ripen at those times.
Right, and you can do that not just with apples, right?
Not just with apples. You can have 90 days of blueberries.
Yeah.
It's not just blueberries for 2 weeks or a month. It's like if you get the early blueberries in the mid-season and the late and the extra late, all of a sudden you've got 90 days where you're picking blueberries.
Yeah.
So and you're right. It's that way with basically everything.
And that's where you're really getting into very solid food production.
Yes.
That's why we want that orchard, because the orchard year after year provides food for you without you tilling the soil, without you working the annual garden. I mean, we want our veggie gardens, but there's a lot of deficiencies to a vegetable garden where a fruit tree, once you get it in, once you get it going, you've got a yield with very low labor year after year after year.
It's amazing. I can break my leg. And I can drag myself
and you're
out
like, well,
in the
no
orchard.
tomatoes tomatoes this year.
Nuts
I'm done.
And apples, and I can live very well just picking up drops.
that is so exciting. So we don't have a whole lot of time, so I want to keep moving through. As far as like buying trees, and so we're getting into, people have gotten it, they got their zone figured out. They're working on a strategy of dwarf versus standard trees, and they're getting their varieties picked out, down to the variety, a few species maybe on their property, and their different varieties, and they're going to go to buy their trees. One of the things I've looked at is you can buy several-year-old trees that are much larger. Obviously, they're a lot more expensive.
Yeah.
Versus buying very young trees that are less expensive. Just tell us a little bit about the planning for that, and is one better than the other, or do they just have kind of pros and cons?
Yeah, definitely. There's pros and cons to both. I would say, just in a nutshell, that bare root trees are the best. They're the way to go.
So that's a bare root tree is a very young tree. You're going to get it delivered kind of like a year old, I think.
Bare root means you get the tree with no dirt on the roots.
No soil around the roots.
It's just a bare rooted.
But they're usually younger, aren't they? Or
they're usually, you're right, they're usually in the 2-year range. So if you buy a tree from a nursery, they range anywhere from $30 to $60 to $100, sometimes for a grafted tree.
Okay.
So
why the bare root trees?
So the bare root trees just have more. If you put a tree in a pot, it grows in a pot. It has limitations that it doesn't meet in the ground. It's a lot of times you're going to get pot-bound trees. You're going to get trees that have a small root wad compared to the top, which is the trees you're talking about. A lot of times, nurseries are selling trees that are 6 feet tall in a little pot.
Yeah, so they really don't have the root mass to support that
The
tree.
way they do that is they put a bunch of nitrogen, chemical nitrogen in there, and so it looks like it's okay.
Right.
But you put it in the ground, and the tree is just not going to do anything for a couple of years. Basically, if you plant,
and you're paying usually a good
paying
amount for
$85,
those trees, and
$100, yeah.
if you don't know, so this is at least good to know if you are doing this, what to expect, because that tree is going to have to put a lot of energy into root growth, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and you're not going to see a lot,
It's going to take a while for that root mass to grow to match the top in that case. So when you get a bare root tree, it's a young tree. If it's been grown well, it's got lots of energy. And when you put it in the ground, when they dug it from the ground, lots of feeder roots and stuff got taken out. But so what you're going to do anyway is you plant it, and then you come in and you clip it, say 2/3 of the way down or something. You're actually removing some of the top to balance it with the roots is one of the reasons, right? And that tree in a couple of years is going to catch up to that big tree you bought and beat it. And for the life of the tree, it's going to be a healthier, more productive tree.
So that bare root tree is a much better foundation in the end to start with.
One caveat with pots: if you can find somebody that's really conscientious about pots and is growing them like tomatoes with the the root maker pots, the pots that don't allow circling, they root prune. You get a nice big mass. If you're getting a young tree that has been grown well and the roots are not pot bound, and you get it, you can get that, stick it in the ground, and the pro to that is no setback at all. It'll put in the ground and just go. But those are going to be a young tree, like a year-old tree.
Yeah. Okay. Good, very good. And I think one of the next ones, and we could probably carry this topic on for an hour or more. But,
days and days.
Yeah, one of the next key ones here to just help with this, just basic orchard planting then is when's the best time of the year to plant. So you're planning ahead and going, okay, I'm going to buy 5 trees, 10 trees. When do you want to be planting them? Fall, spring, summer?
So if you live in a zone 6 or above, it's pretty much standard that you can plant in the fall.
Okay.
The pros to planting in the fall is that when the roots have a temperature in the ground that's warm enough for them to grow, which isn't that warm, they're actually growing.
So 6 and above,
winter.
So in a zone 6 and above, those roots can continue to grow
sometimes
all
through
year.
the winter, even. And if they have a chance, they will, and then they'll just stop, and then it gets warms up down there, and they'll grow a little more. So when spring comes, it's established.
It's taken, and that's how I learned.
Goes like crazy, right? You gain like a year on it.
Right.
But here in 5 and below, they say that's a trial in 5 because you could lose it. You could lose your.
It's kind of iffy.
Yeah. And so spring, I'm going to plant this year as soon as the frost is out of the ground.
Okay.
As soon as it's out of the ground. The key to these dry climates that I've found is to get your trees in the ground early so that they can utilize the moisture, the natural moisture that's there, because once that stops and it starts drying out in June, if you plant it too late, it's just never.
It's just going to dry up.
Yeah,
unless you're giving it water,
and it won't thrive even if you dump water on it. But if you get it in there early enough, it has time to just use that water, get established, and then get going.
So the takeaway is zone 6 and above, you can plant in the fall. That can work really, really well.
Yeah.
But zone 5 and below, especially in a dry climate, you want to get it in a spring as soon as the ground's workable.
I think so.
So that tree is taking advantage of all the spring moisture.
And I do want to say I am trialing doing that in the fall. I'm starting to do that, and I think I have high hopes. It depends on the winter.
Yeah, very good. Well, we're going to run out of time here pretty quick, and you've just given us a bunch of really good information.
Oh, that's great.
And I hope you guys can take this and you've got some tools to start planting your orchard. And it's just so important to get the perennials in. We didn't really get to come back around to the diversity of perennials and what Kaz was talking about getting strawberries in and other early yielding varieties. So maybe that's another conversation. But hope this has really helped you guys out. And it's been great hanging you. Kaz, thanks for coming and joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Josh.
We'll see you guys soon.
Right on.
Okay.